Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. We're just going to take a couple minutes here to let everybody who plans to attend log on, and then we'll get started. So everyone just sit tight for another minute or two. Thank you. Okay, Billy, what do you say?
Yeah, ready to rock whenever.
Okay, hit it.
All right.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us again. Last month, we talked about deionization, and this month we're going to do a little bit more of the same. So very quickly, just to reorient everybody, my name is David Chesnick. I'm the Director of Marketing for Resin Tech. With us today, Bill Coble, who will be presenting. He's our East Region Sales Manager. Peter Myers will be joining remotely. I think he's in the car at the moment, so I think he's just going to be joining on his phone. Caitlin Clark, our technologist, will be handling all the Q&A, and she'll be curating it for us. And Frank Da Silva, again, who's not mentioned here, but he's also on the call as well, and he'll be helping us out along the way. So very quickly, Bill, next slide, the rules of the road. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the microphones are on mute, but what we encourage you to do is use the Q&A feature to submit questions. I know you're tempted to use the chat feature, and we'll be monitoring that, but Q&A is probably best. Feel free to put them in at any time during the presentation, but we'll be addressing them all at the end. The presentation itself will be available both via PDF as well as a recording of this webinar in the next day or so, and we're happy to send that out. At the end, we're going to be using QR codes to collect feedback from all of you, so have your mobile phones ready and just feel free to scan it and give us some feedback on today's presentation. We really value your opinion on these webinars. Next slide, Bill. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Coble, who's going to take us through a little bit more in depth on DI in a service DI environment.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending and your time today. I'm going to probably try to keep this to 50 minutes, but, you know, if any of you know me well, you know I don't talk slow, or I talk fast and I talk long. So hopefully we'll keep it under an hour. And really what we're going to be focusing on today is really the regeneration side of mixed bed DI resin in a service exchange DI environment. So a lot of the concepts are going to be geared towards that. They can be, a lot of it can be applied to in-place regenerable systems. So it's not just one or the other. It can be applied, but there are certain things that we do in portable exchange that we don't do in fixed systems. So some of the fixed system stuff will be left out, but if you have questions on that, please ask at the end. So topics for today, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off in part 1. If you haven't seen part 1, I know that link is out there, or you can email us and we can send it to you for the you can watch it. It's about an hour presentation and then an hour of question and answer, but I'm going to be picking off where we left off. We're going to dive right into regeneration efficiency. It's going to seem a little out of sequence, but I think it's good to talk about in the flow that I do. We'll get into the regen and then talk a little bit about good housekeeping and troubleshooting towards the end. So today's resin topic, we're going to be focusing on the mix bed, which is this, at least the Resin Tech mix bed is a combination of that dark black cation resin, which is a strong acid cation resin, with our typical strong base anion resin. And again, strong, that is this light color, and that's where we get this salt and pepper in the end. We like the black cation resin because, as we'll discuss, it helps you see separation. So it makes regenerations, I think, a little bit easier. Also, our new plant in Camden, which is gearing up as we speak to make cation resin, is also going to be making this dark colored material. So black cation is kind of our thing, and it has a purpose. All right, so let's pick up where we left off. So if you guys didn't see the first one, this is going to seem foreign, but we talked a little bit about mixed bed mixed bed exhaustion before. So if you see my pointer here, typical mixed beds, they'll rinse up to a high quality, and then they'll start slowly coming down, right? Maybe not that slow, but you'll see a quality break of where, it'll eventually die out and have no capacity. But when we talk about capacity of a mixed bed, knowing your endpoint is very important. So if we're going to take our tanks offline at a high quality, in this chart it says 16 megs, but it could be 18, then we're going to be limited to capacity ranges down here. And this is in grains on the x-axis. 5,000-6,000 maybe. And if you're cutting it off at, say, a mega ohm or 2, which is relatively low quality for a mixed bed, you're going to get much longer throughputs. You're going to get kind of 8,000-9,000 grains. So from a capacity calculation, and this is just kind of a screenshot from the spreadsheet that we sent out with the last presentation. Again, we'll include it in this one as well, where we look at where the endpoint would be for a mixed bed. So this is a field regenerated mixed bed. We're looking at different levels of endpoint. And as you can see, the grains capacity that at least that I use in this calculator vary based on where we take it. So if it's only a 50K, which is basically complete exhaustion, you can get upwards of 10,000 grains per cubic foot. But if you're going to cut it off at, say, 10 mega ohm or a relatively high quality, you're only going to get about half that. That's what I wanted to drive home first, is that where you end your mix bed will dictate the throughput. So we can't apply a high capacity if you're going to be cutting it off at a very high quality throughput endpoint. So keep that in mind. Then from the calculator, we also talked about a lot the last presentation about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is present in all waters. Very low levels, but relatively to TDS. But once you put it through like an RO system, for example, those CO2 dissolved in water will pass right through the membrane. So even though your water quality, let's say your TDS out of an RO is maybe 1 ppm, the varying levels of CO2 are going to have a very dramatic impact on your throughputs. And it can vary. There's no set number. Now we can calculate that if we know the pH and the alkalinity of your water incoming to, say, an RO system. There actually is a way that you can calculate exactly how much CO2 is in the water. I'm not going to go crazy into that because that would take 20 minutes on its own, but there is a method to find that out without having to physically test it. But what I want to drive here is same TDS water, varying levels of CO2, and just picking this 10 mega ohm endpoint. Look at the various throughputs you can get. If you only have 2 ppm, you can get upwards of, in this example, 26,000 gallons a cubic foot. But if you have 20 parts per million of CO2, which is very possible, you'll only get 3,600 gallons per cubic foot. So there is a big difference. Even though the TDS numbers are the same, that varying level of CO2 will play a major role in your throughput calculations. We can also put silica in this context. Silica itself is not dissolved, it doesn't, or excuse me, it's not ionized, and it's not really conductive. So if your customer happens to have a silica spec that you need to adhere to, we could actually toss in another column just like CO2 and add the silica in with that. A lot of times I'll just throw it in, lump it in here, but you'll also see that impact. And silica could be at levels through an RO of ppm levels if it's not treated properly. So just because it doesn't register conductivity doesn't mean there might not be something in the water that impact your throughputs. I want to make sure I drove that home in a little bit more detail. When we get into tap water environments or city water or just TDS bearing waters, so in this example, a couple of hundred ppm, yes, you can still have varying levels of carbon dioxide, but as you can see, if we look at the throughput estimates, yeah, I mean, it's 40, 50 gallons difference, but it's not the end of the world if you kind of make a mistake in terms of accounting for it. 415 versus 383, it's not the end of the world. We're not going to have a situation of, oh boy, we projected this would last roughly 3 months and it only lasted 4 weeks. You're not going to get that kind of phone call in these scenarios. So it's really most important when we're talking about RO throughputs, RO effluents, et cetera. Now, one thing we also talked about last time is the varying capacity difference between a virgin resin and a regenerated resin. And when we talk about virgin, I'm talking in the context of it came from the factory regenerated, whether it's Resin Tech or somebody else. We use doses and techniques that really maximize the amount of hydrogen and hydroxide conversion we put on a strong acid cation or a strong base anion resin. It's the most well regenerated that resin is ever going to be. Typical field regeneration, which we're going to review, you're not going to get quite those same levels back. So when we look at this in a mixed bed context, yeah, virgin capacity for a mixed bed is upwards of 13,000, calling it grains per cubic foot. But your average, just kind of what we looked at down that chart and the capacity calculator, you might only get about 8,000. That's a pretty big difference. And there's reasons why. So I wanted to talk about those reasons first, then we'll get into the regeneration itself. Now, when we talk about regen, the capacity will really come down to obviously how much chemical you throw at it, but it also matters what's on the resin itself. So it's not just how much, it's what's on it already. But then in our world of field regeneration, portable exchange DI, there is a law of diminishing returns, meaning how high of a dose can I go to get the best bang for my buck so that A, I'm maximizing as much capacity as I can really get from a cost perspective without going too overboard and wasting money, but using too little that I'm not getting the throughputs that my customers accustomed to, whether from my business or from maybe a competitor that you're trying to replace. So in the end, it's a balancing act. And let's go through this. So I'm going to throw a bunch of charts at you guys. They're all going to look the same. The y-axis is really discussing the percent conversion or the percent regeneration, not really in grains numbers. We're going to look at this as, is it 60, 70, 80, 90% regenerated? The x-axis is always going to be in chemical pounds per cubic foot. And we're really going to be talking in this 8 to 10 pound range. This is kind of the wheelhouse, as I call it, of efficiency in terms of field regeneration, where you're giving it a good enough kick that you're getting the best regeneration you really can, versus too low where we're kind of on the downside of some of these curves where, yeah, for an extra pound you can get a lot more. This range kind of where it levels off. In the case of the cation resin here, which we'll talk about first, I'm showing both sulfuric and hydrochloric acid, but for the most part we're using hydrochloric acid in a portable exchange DI environment. We don't really see sulfuric acid used, and there are reasons for that. But if you get into fixed field regeneration situations, you'll see a lot of sulfuric acid. And I'll talk about it now. The tricky part about sulfuric is that calcium sulfate is very insoluble. It only takes a couple of thousand ppm for it to precipitate out of solution. And that can happen in and around the resin bead itself. So if you have a hardness bearing water and you're using DI resin that is removing it, and you go to regenerate it, and if you were to happen to overdose the sulfuric acid too soon, you basically foul the cation resin with calcium sulfate. And if you guys have ever dealt with it, it's not something easily fixed. You can't just rinse it out. You can't just soak it in hydrochloric acid and it goes away. For all intents and purposes, that resin is done and you're just going to move on from it, meaning throw it away and replace it. Hydrochloric acid doesn't have that problem. You're not going to get any co-precipitation during regeneration. It's actually the best acid for regeneration because of that. You know, you can dissolve a lot of things off the resin. You don't have to worry about resin fouling out. So for the most part, hydrochloric acid is what we're going to use in our portable exchange environment. All right, so let's dive into the ions on the resin. So we're going to talk about the cation resin, like our CG8 black, and it's in the 100% sodium form. So if I go to regenerate 100% sodium form cation resin with 8 to 10 pounds per cubic foot and 10% hydrochloric acid, which is roughly what you're going to use. Usually it's 7 to 10%, but this all falls in the same range. You get a very nice regeneration. You can get 90 to roughly 96, 97% conversion. That's fantastic. Again, the virgin resin you get is upwards up here, you know, call it 20 pounds of regen, where you're getting basically 100% regenerated, 99.9999%. But sodium form resins actually regenerate quite efficiently. You get that 90 to 96, 97% conversion. Let's say this resin doesn't have 100% sodium, it's got 100% calcium. Calcium form resins are not as efficiently regenerated. Same chart basically, but that 8 to 10 pound range, we're only getting maybe 70 to, let's call it 75% conversion. Calcium is actually much more difficult to regenerate off the DI resin than sodium. So, and it has to do with divalent ions. It has to do with just how the selectivity equilibrium works. I'm not going to go into that today, but basically sodium is really easy to get off because it's a one-to-one exchange in the cation world, and the selectivity heavily favors the hydrogen ion in that scenario. But with the calcium ion, it actually favors the calcium, it being a divalent on the resin. So that's a big difference. 90 to 97% versus 70 to maybe 75%. On average, what we see most from the field is a roughly 80 to, call it 85% cation conversion. That's normal. And that's usually due to a mixture of different ions on the resin itself, whether it's calcium or sodium. So it's never going to be one or the other. It's going to be a combination of these two. We get to the anion side. Now we're dealing with anion resin, obviously, but we're dealing with sodium hydroxide. And in this case, we have a 100% chloride form anion resin. We're always going to use sodium hydroxide, and the most common dose range or common concentration range we use for regen is a roughly 4%. And as you'll see on many of these next couple of charts, yeah, there is a difference between the higher concentration and the lower, but for the most part, the lower is the most efficient way to do it. So if we see here with the chloride form anion to the hydroxide form, you're getting roughly 60, maybe 63% conversion. That's normal. We do an ion like sulfate, 100% sulfate form resin, that same 4% sodium hydroxide at that 8 to 10 pounds per cubic foot range. Now we're getting up there. Now it's closer to, let's call that 68 to maybe 73%. Let's talk about bicarbonate. Bicarbonate comes in the form of CO2 reduction, because CO2 combines with the hydroxide group on the anion resin to become bicarbonate, potentially carbonate, or it can just be removed as alkalinity. Alkalinity primarily is bicarbonate in water. But as you can see, 8 to 10 pounds of sodium hydroxide at 4%, now you're getting closer to 83, 87% conversion. The typical regen we see from a field resin is roughly in that 60 to 70% range. And a lot of times that has to do whether they're using brine to separate or not, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But that is normal. If you see 60%, 65% conversion of your anion resin, that's normal. And that's because of this combination of anions that can be on the resin itself. And again, if we're using brine to separate, you're going to be putting a lot of chlorides on it. So I'm going to go all the way back to this slide. We talked about how virgin capacity is upwards of 13,000. Regenerated resin is typically down in that, call it the 8,000 give or take range. This is the reason why, is because you're only getting so much conversion back, and most of it is due to the anion resin conversion getting roughly that 60 to 70% range on average. So that explains that, and I'm sure you guys are all clear and on the same page with me. That's the reason behind it. So as we talked about, the resin capacity, what you recover, is really a function of what was left on it. In terms of what we're concerned about in the field coming off the resin, as we talked about last time, the sodium leakage is our primary concern when it comes to cation resin. Well, if you're having sodium leakage problems or poor rinse up issues, a lot of times it can be traced back to the sodium leakage. So that's an indicator something went wrong in the regen, or something was in there that shouldn't have been. On the anion side, and I'm not really harping on it too much today, but silica is the first thing that usually leaks off an anion resin. Things like sulfate and chloride don't really leak off. They're not really going to cause you to have poor quality issues. It's more of a capacity problem. But you get into the lower held anions, silica is the first guy to come off. So if your customer has a silica spec, you can still be making water quality, but you could still have silica coming through. The next ion that tends to come off is really the bicarbonate, but kind of has CO2 to a degree. That can leak off, but that's usually right in an imminent point of the other things pushing it off. The first thing you're really going to notice is silica. And the only real way to get silica off a resin, it behaves a little bit differently. Silica, being a non-ionized species, really combines with the hydroxide functional group on an anion resin, and for a lack of a better description, kind of dissolves into the resin. And so to get the silica back off again, we kind of have to redissolve it off the resin and back into the sodium hydroxide solution. Well, in a cold, typical cold water environment, which is our, call it 50 to 60 degree Fahrenheit in waters that we typically use, that doesn't happen very well or very efficiently at all. In order to get that redissolving off the resin to happen, you really need heat, and you need hot, water upwards of 100 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, it's not the end of the world if you're not using heat for your anion regen. As long as your customer doesn't have a silica spec, you don't really have a problem there. But if they do have a silica spec, or you find out kind of after the fact, the only real way you're going to be able to manage the silica content coming off the resin during service is by introducing heat to the regeneration. It also helps with rinsing. Not so much the cation. Acid rinses out of the cation resin pretty efficiently on its own, even with cold water. Sometimes it can be finicky, but the anion resin, if any of you are involved in regen, I'm sure can attest, some days that caustic just does not want to rinse out. Well, hot water can help speed that up very, very quickly. All right, and then when coming to dose, yes, we're always targeting that 8 to 10 pound range, but really the more chemical you throw at it, the better water quality you should see on the back end. So if you're having some troubles and you don't really know why, and you call us and ask for some help, we might say, hey, give it a double dose and see if that solves the problem, because that can help us troubleshoot and say, hey, okay, there might be something wrong with your chemical addition, your adductor, whatever the case may be in terms of, what might be causing the poor quality. If a double regen, quote unquote, solves that problem, then usually it's something's going on in your system there to cause an issue. All right, so back to our friends, the curves. So because the mixed bed, virgin mixed beds are very well regenerated, you get this very sharp upwards rinse, holds quality for an incredibly long time. And then really the way it dies, it comes down sharp. I'll call this a cliff per se. So it holds quality a long time and then comes down. Well, that's because it's very well regenerated. The components are mixed extremely well. You know, everything is just perfect, quote unquote, to be able to kind of see that quick drop off. You know, as we talked about earlier, field regeneration is not like that. You know, you'll rinse up maybe a little bit slower, but then once it starts coming down, it takes a little bit longer. There's a lot of capacity there that you gain with virgin that you kind of lose with regenerated. So if you have a finicky customer that wants to hold the highest water quality for the highest period of time, if they're not happy with what your regenerated resin does or what you can do with tanks in series, you know, virgin resin tends to solve that problem. Here's a resin that has a problem. Rinsed up, but then it started coming down almost immediately, kind of making quality, but then just kind of dies off. This is what we call a mixed bed that's crashing. And crashing a lot of times comes from something that went wrong in the regeneration process, whether it would be poor separation, poor regens, maybe something happened in the mix. As we get into the mixed bed regen portion here, every single step has a purpose. You know, as much science as there is behind all of this, there is some art that has to be taken into account. Not every batch of mixed bed is going to behave the same way. Not every batch of mixed bed is going to do exactly what you want. You know, and that makes it challenging, I think, in a portable exchange service DI environment, because really your end goal is you want to make a consistent product. You want to make the best water quality for as long a period of time as you can for your customer. But really, you know, you got to make your process as easy as possible to repeat over and over again. And I think that really all starts with paying attention to the details. And I'm hoping to kind of go over some of those details today that maybe some of us have forgotten over time. Maybe we're not implementing today that we can, that are just some simple things that might help you and improve your product. You know, at the end of the day, this is your product you're putting into the field. You know, let's see if we can help improve it or help solve some problems for you. All right, so here is our typical regeneration setup. This is a classic Ecodyne style regen plant. Whether you, the quote unquote, have an Ecodyne plant or one that was custom built, they're all going to look pretty similar here. You have a separator column. Usually it's very tall to separate the resins from one another. Regen vessels, one for cation, one for anion. I don't know if you see this, but the anion vessel is here. It's a little bit bigger than the cation vessel. Sometimes you might have multiple regenerators, you know, maybe 4 tanks, you know, for either staging or doing different regenerations at different times, etc. And then in the end, there's always a mixer. Now there are the smaller, what we call the funnel plants, and I didn't quite have a good picture of that, so I didn't include it here. But a funnel plant is basically a single tank separator that then you regenerate inside the service exchange vessels on your own, and then you put the resin back into the funnel to mix. So it's basically the same process here, just not broken up into big tanks. So even if you have this you don't have a plant like this, and you might just have a funnel plant, everything we're about to talk about is going to apply. It just applies a little bit differently because of your system. In terms of regenerating mixed bed, the sequence really isn't any different than what you would do for a water softener, for example, or an in-place, anything in-place regenerable in the field. You still need to backwash. And in the case of a mixed bed, the purpose of the backwash is also separation. You're going to be adding chemical. You're going to be rinsing it out with a slow and a fast rinse. And then in the case of mixed bed, we got to remix it into the vessels and put it into service. So the sequence isn't anything really different than what you would do for any other unit. So backwash, basically lifting the resin up. And the purpose of it is to remove any suspended solids, any resin fines that might be in the vessels, but also we got to get that cation and anion resin to separate. So in a perfect ideal resin separation world, the cation resin, which is the dark resin, always goes to the bottom, and the anion resin sits on top. In a perfect world, that line, you can see a perfect line every single time. Well, it doesn't always work like that, right? A lot of times there is what we call an interface or an intermix layer that can occur. And this just happens because beads stick together. or there might be, well, I'll get into here in a second, there's a reason why you get an intermix layer. Cation resin is denser and so it wants to fall. Anion resin is lighter and it does want to go to the top from a density perspective. And the resins of mixed beds today are really designed to separate, but sometimes we get this, it's stuck in the middle situation. Well, what do? Well, we got to try to break that up and get it as separated as we can, which we'll talk about some techniques, but ideally we want this layer never to be more than, call it 3 to 6 inches. If you're getting into like a foot of intermix layer, we do want to try to make it smaller and smaller because that where it kind of throws off the balance of your regeneration. In terms of what can hurt us when we try to go separate, we're looking at a few things. The first thing is your separator is designed for a certain volume of resin, meaning it's designed for 20 cubic feet. You want to put 20 cubic feet in there. Really designed for twice the expansion. It's really designed for 100% expansion. If we try to jam twice as much resin into a column that was designed for, say, 20 cubic feet, well, you're only going to, can only get it so far. So you tend to leave a larger intermix or you don't get as good of a separation. So really the first thing you need to do is don't overload your separator. Keep it consistent. Resins themselves like to stick to one another. In fact, the cleaner the resin, the more it likes to stick to one another. And this has to do a lot of times with a couple of things. One, when the resins are still in their hydrogen and their hydroxide form, they create a lot of static charge. And those static charges are opposite given the opposite resins. So this tends to make the resin stick together in your separator. So how do we manage that? Well, if your resin is still in the hydrogen hydroxide form coming back from your client, the easiest thing to do is kind of get rid of that capacity. And a simple thing you could do is just hook it up to your own water supply or an RO system and feed your DI water storage tank. Use it as makeup water. Another thing you do is kill it, which we'll talk about brine kill here at the end. But getting it out of those forms is very important. Now, when the resin's newer, it tends to be cleaner and it tends to clump. It can clump. Well, how do we manage that? Well, you can keep backwashing it and try to separate it, but a lot of times sometimes you need to air mix it. I know that seems silly in your separator column, but that's a great way to get rid of that static charge. Basically, you're banging the resin beads together. And as they bang together, they neutralize each other's charge and they tend to go away. So if you are getting a lot of stickiness in a separator column and a brine separation isn't helping, a good old air mix will kind of help your cause there. Or if you're not using brine, a good old air mix will take care of that a lot of times. Sometimes it's an equipment issue. If the equipment's old and you're running it hard just to keep up with your demand, sometimes the separation column internals, maybe something's broken down there. Maybe the flow is not getting as even as you want it to. Ideally, when we backwash and we separate, we want to lift that bed nice and consistently. But if you have something off in your internals, it might flip it to one side. You might get more flow on one side than the other, and then you got to slow it down, re-level, and on all these tricks. If you're having that kind of internal issue, it's just better off emptying the thing out and fixing it so you can kind of get back to normal. The other thing I've seen quite a bit is backwash flow rates. It's okay to have to kind of introduce flow quickly at first just to kind of get the resin to lift up. But once it starts moving, you really want to kind of slow it down so you get this nice clean separation and movement of the resin. If you do it too fast, you just kind of throw it all up in there and it takes a little bit longer for it to kind of settle down and kind of get to that separation level that you want with that clean line. So it's always good to just be very mindful. Don't go too fast on your backwash flow rates. At first, it's okay, but you need to slow it down to just let the resin fall apart from each other. Another thing I see quite a bit is just air. You got this tank full of resin and water, and the water level is way above the top of the resin bed. And then you turn the pump on or open the valve for the backwash flow, and there's big bubble of air comes right up through the middle of the resin bed, and it just shoots anion resin all the way to the top, right? And you're like, man, and that's good resin, you know, that we don't want to see backwash out. So one thing I always recommend is if you're going to do a separation, lower the water level down, bring it to the top of the resin bed. So that way, if you do get an air bubble that shoots up through the bottom, you know, it just pops at the top and you don't have all this resin shooting up. Then start your backwash flow rate and separation. It'll go a little bit more quickly and smoother. And then finally, when we get into back to the ionic forms of the resin and things sticking together, one of the easiest ways to get the resin to separate is basically brine kill the resin. And there's multiple different ways you can do this. You can simply take your exchange vessels and pump a dilute brine solution through it. You know, not even in the separator, that's outside the separator. You could even have a little recirc station and with the brine solution and just have it go around in a circle and you just kind of feed more brine to keep it going. That's an easy way to do it. But most people will just introduce brine to the backwash or to the separator itself. And there's really no right or wrong way to do this. It's always best to do a mild brine kill versus a harsh brine kill, meaning, you know, low doses of salt, you know, call it half 1%. It's usually good enough to, you know, once you put enough brine over it to get it to ionically go into the sodium and the chloride form, or at least get rid of that leftover hydrogen and hydroxide. But a lot of times we're just pumping old pure brine in the backwash because we want it to be quickly as possible. I understand that. But if you have a high level of hydroxide or hydrogen left on the resin, that can actually work against you a little bit. And you can kind of damage the resin over time. And that's not uncommon. So in terms of how we apply the brine kill, you know, I think every plant is unique and different. I think it's always better off to introduce a low concentration for a longer period of time because that helps preserve your resin from breaking up or even potentially cracking and creating, you know, just decreasing the life overall of your float. Okay, the whole point of the brine kill, like I said, is to get rid of that hydrogen and hydroxide form. And really, in the end, what you're doing is really increasing the density difference between the two resins. And really what you're doing is making the cation resin pretty much as dense as you can get it. And then the anion resin is much lighter in terms of density, and it will want to separate, coupling that with the particle sizes themselves. And that's really the point, is just to get really that cation resin as dense as possible. So as you talked about, there are some drawbacks. And when you introduce too much brine too fast, what you can do is fracture those resin beads due to osmotic shock. You know, these resins shrink and swell when you change the form. And I'm sure you guys have seen this. Cation resin, not so much. You see it a lot in the anion resin. If you were to take a pure chloride form anion resin and you were to do your typical field regeneration to it, you're going to see a swell of that resin from 10 to 15%, is usually what we see on average. On the virgin side, when we make it in our plant, it swells more closer to 20%. And that goes back to that, how well we can get it regenerated and the regeneration levels that we achieve. You know, we're pushing 90, 95%, if not more. Typical field regeneration is roughly called 60 to 70%. And that's why it doesn't swell back as much. But anion resins are definitely more fragile than cations. So if you're introducing brine too quick and you shrink that bead really, really quickly, that can actually shatter it. Now, a bead that's broken, or excuse me, that's cracked, that's shattered still works. It's still a bead. The problem is now what happens the next go around or two? Well, a shattered cracked bead then starts breaking apart and you get some resin fines. So what we see a lot and mostly in the field with brine, you know, plants that use brine kill, which is most of them, and I do encourage it. I do think it makes your process more efficient. You will see quite a bit of anion resin loss over time. So it's always good to have some anion resin handy, you know, whether it's a drum, a chloride form, just so you can top off so you keep your balance in your plant where you need it every single time. You know, you definitely don't want to put less anion resin in your mix beds because, as we talked about with the CO2 and the silica, the anion resin is always your limiting factor in most cases, if not all of them, when it comes to mix bed. The other aspect of keeping some anion resin around is important is if you're using mix bed. So if you're buying mix bed as your float makeup, and then you go to regenerate that same mix bed, you never get the same volume back And again, that has to do with the swelling and the regeneration. You know, that resin from us is always 20, is that maximum 20% due to the regen levels. Well, if you're only getting roughly 10 to 15% back, you can see loss of resin just from that alone. So it's not that the resin went anywhere. It's just the ability to get it to swell back to that original size, original volume. You never quite get there. So, you know, putting in a half a cubic foot every once in a while is probably going to be what is necessary to, and I need to put that in context, but being able to top off your float every once in a while, that's the other reason. So anion resin tends to be the most fragile. You're going to lose that first the most, and then making up extra due to just the swell loss is important. And here's some pictures. So this is a good picture of just good old virgin resin, good whole beads, good mixture of the two. These aren't really mixed beds, but this kind of proves my point. You know, this is what physically broken resin looks like. So over time, you know, some of these cracked beads, they just start falling apart and becoming these broken shards that, you know, eventually backwash out. Sometimes they cause cross-contamination. And this is kind of what we want to avoid. But I will say, most surface exchange DI floats we've seen in analysis usually have a good 20 to 30% cracked beads. Again, that's not bad. It's the broken ones we're always looking for. You know, and as long as there's a low amount of broken beads, you're okay. That's normal, right? And then here's a picture of oxidized resin. It still kind of looks like beads, but these are very soft. Like if you were to pick up an oxidized resin bead in your finger, you can, you know, rub it in your finger and it disappears. Well, that's typically what that's what oxidized resin is. Kind of pastes in your fingers itself. We don't see this too much in service DI, but it can happen if you got a high chlorinated water supply constantly bombarding the DI resins. They can oxidize over time. So if you are doing a lot of tap water or city water service exchange, it's always good to protect your mix beds with activated carbon. And, you know, again, when you think about what what the service exchange DI world is, this is your product. This resin is your asset. This is what's making you money. Every time you buy a cubic foot, your goal is for that to make you thousands upon thousands of dollars in regeneration over time. Well, if you're not protecting it, you're just going to constantly be replenishing that investment. Obviously, you want to make that last as long as possible. So it's always good to protect it. All right, so separation, you know, every step of the way is critically important. But if we don't get the separation right, everything you do down the road is not going to be good. So the first thing and the most important thing we have to do is minimize cross-contamination. So that goes back to the intermix layer. That goes back to, you know, properly getting it to float up without having the two mixing with one another. You know, in the end, really what we're trying to avoid is cation resin in the anion resin. And that's not good at all. Anion in your cation is okay, but we really want to avoid that cation in the anion. So if we do that, we keep our interface as small as possible. And then when it comes to drawing the resins apart, because you can't regenerate them in a separation column, you have to put it into those separate regen vessels. It's best to always draw the anion off the top, and you want to do it slowly and meticulously. So typical separation, yeah, we have our anion, good anion on the top, or good anion on the bottom, or excuse me, cation on the bottom, and then we have the intermix layer. Well, if we're drawing off the resin right at the intermixed, you know, whenever you do this draw off point, you're always getting kind of this funneling effect or this vortex. So it's always going to pull some from the top, some from the bottom, and then some from the middle. Well, if you're pulling the resin right off at the interface, well, guess what? All this cation resin is going to be in with your anion resin. To help avoid this, you want to move it up. Your takeoff point should be high. It should be up in the anion resin. You should need to introduce a slow backwash to lift the bed up to your takeoff point. So if you're not doing that now, you know, a lot of times these takeoffs are like literally just pipes with an elbow and a piece of pipe sticking up, kind of an L-shaped piece of pipe. Well, it's okay to have it high because you can always backwash up to get the resin to fall in. And then as that interface rises up close near the top of that pipe, you kind of slow the backwash down. And in most separator columns, you're going to leave resin inside the column. You're not trying to draw the whole thing off. You're best served leaving the interface behind. The other thing too is you usually end up with a lot of extra cation resin. And this goes back to just what we talked about with the anion. Anion resin loss is the most frequent. There is the volume changes from virgin mixed bed to regenerated mixed beds. A lot of times I see it time and again where I walk into a plant, well, man, we got so much cation in the separator, it's getting tricky to work around. Simple answer to that is get it out. Take it out of there. It's okay. The resin's still perfectly good. You can just put it in a drum and store it, or you can take other anion resin and mix it and make new mixed bed. If you're getting to a point where your separator is getting burdened with too much cation resin, it's okay to just take it out of there. But once you've done your anion takeoff, you've gotten that clean, and you would go to draw the cation off the bottom. Again, at that point, it's okay to pull a little anion resin with it. It's not ideal, obviously, because it's just loss of capacity there, but it's not the end of the world if you have to draw it all off at the bottom. The key point I want to make here is keep that anion transfer as pure as possible so that we don't get cation resin in with the anion resin. Well, why? Why do we care? Well, think about what you're regenerating the resins with. Anion resins are regenerated with sodium hydroxide. If you have cation resin mixed with that anion, you're regenerating it with a sodium form chemistry. Any cation resin that's in with your anion will be put into the sodium form. And then obviously you're going to go mix it with your resin, everything at the end. You've just introduced excess sodium into your mix bed. And this can cause the mix beds to crash. It can cause poor water quality. It can cause short throughputs. So it's very important to try to minimize as much cation in your anion as possible, and that's the reason why. Conversely, having anion in your cation is not the end of the world. If we're using hydrochloric acid, well, any anion that's in with that cation is just put into the chloride form. Chloride doesn't really leak off, doesn't really cause quality issues. What it does is just you have some loss of capacity because obviously that anion resin is in a hydroxide form. So at the end of the day, it's not the end of the world. Plus, when we talk about the limiting factors of a mixed bed, it's always the anion. So what ends up happening is there's always plenty of cation capacity left over. If you happen to have a bunch of anion mixed in with it, you're really not losing much because you still have plenty of leftover cation resin to begin with in the hydrogen form. So to kind of sum it all up, minimize that cross-contamination during transfer. Be very meticulous on your backwashing. Make sure you get good separation. If you're using the brine separation, make sure you get what you want in terms of that interface. And then as you're transferring the resin over, a little slow backwash always helps. Lifting up to your transfer point versus trying to work around an interface is always good. If you are having troubles or things look out of whack, just stop. Re-level the beds, stop the transfer, kind of restart over again. Because again, if you don't get this portion right, everything you do down the line really isn't going to matter much at all. All right, chemical addition. I'm not going to go crazy into this. We kind of went all over that at the beginning here. But obviously you're regenerating with acid on the cation, sodium hydroxide, on the anion side. You apply your chemical doses, make sure you got the right concentrations for the right amount of time, and doing all the things necessary to get that proper dose. When we talk about dose, it's really a combination of three things. It's not just the chemical concentrations. It's not just the amount of chemical. It's also the flow rate in which we apply it. And then obviously all that over a period of time. That's what really equals your dose. Typical flow rate for regeneration of DI resins is anywhere from 0.5 to 1 gallon a minute per cubic foot. And then when it comes to chemical dosing, we're using a roughly 10% hydrochloric acid solution. That usually equates to approximately a 20-ish to 30-minute chemical regen time. Anion is longer. You're only using 4% sodium hydroxide. And we do want to expose that anion resin to as much hydroxide at that concentration for as long as possible. That usually will take, 45 to an hour. And sometimes the longer, the better. So it's okay. They don't mean to be the same time. So if you are regenerating your anion resin and it's only taking 20 or 30 minutes, the odds are your concentration might be too high. and that you're actually better off backing down your concentration and doing it for a longer period of time. All of this is what controls in the end your capacity and your leakage. And it's always important to make sure all parameters are met. So if something you feel is out of whack, this is usually, assuming separations are good, the next phase of this is, are your parameters met? Are you meeting the flow rate and time with your chemical concentration to meet that proper dose level? And then you get on the anion side, rinsing, and of course the silica reduction is always improved by using warm sodium hydroxide in that 100 to 120 degree Fahrenheit range. It certainly helps with normal regens, but it's a marginal difference. You really only want to use the heat when you're looking at silica. Okay, just like any other ion exchange, there is a displacement and a slow rinse. The whole purpose of this is just to move that tank full of acid or caustic through. You know, again, you've regenerated this for 20 minutes. Now you have a tank full of chemical. Well, that chemical still has value and still can do a lot of work for you. So slow rinse is important. Don't skip that. We want to push that slug of chemistry through the bed, get as much dose out of it as we can. And then, you know, when we're done, we can begin the fast rinse process. And really the whole point of the fast rinse process is just to rinse the chemical out, right? You know, again, hot water will help that cause for sure, but we certainly don't want to leave any acid or caustic inside the resin beds because, again, you're about to mix them back up again. So if we leave a lot of sodium hydroxide in the anion resin, as soon as we go to mix that up, that's all going on the cation resin. And conversely, hydrochloric acid left in the cation that gets mixed with the anion resin, all that chloride is going to start consuming your hydroxide sites on your anion. So it's very important to rinse these down. Now, typically at this stage of the game, you know, backwash is typically, you can use soft water. Heck, I've seen people use tap water with hardness in it. It's fine. But once you get to a point where you're introducing the chemicals, you really want to be using deionized water, because at this point, you're trying to get all of the chemistry you want on the resin, hydrogen hydroxide. Using deionized water helps preserve those capacities. If you're using tap water or soft water, I mean, you certainly can, but any gallons you use to rinse is just going to consume the capacity of the resin. And then specifically on the anion side, you cannot use a hard water at all. It has to be at least soft, or at least the cations removed, because the calcium that's in that water is going to foul your anion resin. You are going to get calcium carbonate precipitation. It's unavoidable. It happens immediately. So I can't stress enough that all the waters you use for regeneration, from the point of introducing chemical to rinsing, really should be a DI-RO water source to help preserve not only the capacity, but also the resin itself. Now, in terms of what quality rinse down to, I've seen that be all over the place. And there's really, to me, it comes down to what your end goals are for your clients. I've been in plants where we rinse them down to 10 microsiemens per centimeter, and that's what we do. And I think that's fantastic. You know, that's a very clean resin. Been in other plants where it's like, we're happy below 200. Again, that's perfectly acceptable. You might be sacrificing a little capacity on the back end, but you know, that tends to lead to faster rinse out times, right? So in terms of what quality you want to rinse down to, I think it always comes down to what your end goals are. And in my personal opinion, I don't think you need to be as aggressive as maybe 10 microsiemens per centimeter. You know, I think anything less than 100 is more than adequate. And then in most cases, something less than 200 is more than acceptable. So I've just seen that over and over again. You know, because when you look at the overall water volume you use for regeneration, most of it comes from this fast rinse. So if you're really extending your fast rinse times to get an uber low quality of water, which again is great, but it also might be contributing to 70% of your waste volume. That's tricky. So if you can cut back on that rinse quality and you don't see any after effects of capacity or quality in the field with your client base, this would be a good point in which you can look at maybe cutting back some water usage. The other thing too is rinse recycle. And this is something we you know, try to bring us. I have, I know Frank has too. We talk about it with our DI customer bases. Another way to save water on fast rinse is when you get down to a point of quality. Let's call it 200 microsiemens. At that point, instead of trying to keep rinsing it down the lower quality, you can literally recirculate the water between the two resins, the cation and the anion, because any trace hydrochloric from the cation is going to get removed by the anion, and conversely, any trace sodium hydroxide will get removed by the cation resin in the recirculation environment. Yes, you're going to be adding, you're going to be putting load on the resin. Yes, you're going to be losing capacity. But if you do the math a lot of times, when you look at the overall volume of water in that system at that point, and you go to recirculate, you'll see that a lot of times it's less than 0.5%. But less than 0.5% of your overall capacity. It's not a lot. And you're going to do that rinsing the darn things up anyway, or your customer is going to do that as well. So if you haven't talked about rinse recycle, or it's something you want to consider, I think it's a great way to save on fast rinse water volumes, and it might speed up your final rinse up processes. But you got to be careful. You got to make sure that quality is correct and accurate before you kick it into rinse recycle. If you didn't get a good reading, or you didn't read it, and all of a sudden you sent 3,000 microsiemen water to those resin beds, it's no longer 0.5%. It could be 10%. It could be 5%. It could have negative effect. So if you are going to go that route, we definitely want to make sure that all the ducks are in a row in terms of where your quality's at. Talked about this last time too. Let's talk about floats. Resins that treat RO water primarily, and resins that treat tap waters primarily, they are different animals when it comes to resin quality. An RO water is very clean, or even pre-treatment from another DI system. These resins are very clean. A lot of times the only thing that really accumulates on an RO is things like sodium and chloride and CO2. Things like tap water, you kind of get the whole gamut of water chemistry, from hardness to sulfates. But the other thing you get quite a bit is TOC. And TOC can also impact resin quality. These organics like the the anion resin, well, they're big organic acids. And acids are anionic in nature in terms of their group. If they park themselves on an anion resin, and you go to regenerate with that sodium hydroxide, all those little weak acid sites that are hanging on the ends and around that organic acid that's stuck on the resin, it will be put into the sodium form. Well, you go to rinse up, and you try to rinse up your final mix bed, and guess what? Your quality decreased, because at that point, all those little sodium groups that are hanging off that organic are now putting that sodium back into the final water. Well, if I'm only trying to make 50K water, or less than a meg, or a little less than a meg, that's usually not the problem. The problem is if I tried to take that resin that's organically fouled and I put it on a water supply, now I'm trying to make 18 megs off an RO, you're never going to make it. It's always going to hover lower, and you're going to be frustrated that, why isn't this rinsing up? I did everything right. I separated well, I regenerated well, my dose was good, I did everything right. Well, it's not anything you did, it's just the resin is fouled with an organic. This is why I always encourage keeping these floats separate, so you don't mix up having a city water resin going to an RO client that's not making the 16 plus mega ohm they might need. So it's something to keep in mind if you're not following this. Now, it's not easy to do. I know not everybody can do it, but if there's a way for you to kind of keep your resin segregated, it's going to help you in the long run. Now, if your resin does get fouled with organics, you can try to clean it using a brine caustic treatment. That's usually the best approach. Not always easy to do. It's actually best to be done on a preventive maintenance. If you're doing it because the resin is so fouled, a lot of times you're never going to be able to recover it. So this is why I like float segregation, because we don't have to worry about this so much, because a lot of times you just move the resin down the line. If your city water float's kind of getting fouled out, well, pull some resin off the high purity, put it in to kind of freshen that one up, and then you can introduce brand new resin or newer resin to the higher end float and then kind of refreshes that one up as well. So that's kind of my comment on float management there. All right, so we're talking about mixing. Mixing the resins together. In an ideal world, dry mixing it theoretically is the best. It's the most intimate. that's also labor intensive. And when I talk about dry mixing, I'm talking about literally storing the components in a drum, and then you have a cement mixer and you're bucking it in resin, and you let the cement mixer roll and it gets a nice mix, and then you dump it back into a drum to load into a tank. Obviously, that takes a lot of time and effort. We do it quite a bit at Resin Tech, actually, as part of some of the products we make. And it is the best theoretically, but when it comes to practicality, wet mixing is more than fine, and really what most of us do, including Resin Tech, when we make our virgin products, because we can do a large volume very quickly. And really the key when it comes to wet mixing is we want to keep the resins together. We don't want to risk them separating. And there's a couple ways you can do that in your mixing column. First is you want to keep the water level, at to the top of the resin bed, not really too much above. A little bit's okay, but not a lot. Ideally, you want to keep it at or below the resin bed. And then as you're air mixing, and you're getting that tank rumbling, and that's really a good way to know, is my air mix going well? Well, is the tank shaking? If it is, then you're doing fine. If the tank's not shaking, you may not have enough air going in there. But if the tank is moving, you're getting good rumbling, you're getting a really good separation, or excuse me, really good mix. And sometimes, and usually that only takes maybe 10 or 15 minutes. If you really want to, be meticulous about that mixing, you can actually really draw the water off as you're doing the air mix until it just becomes kind of a solid block of resin, and then fill it back up slowly when you need to transfer it into your exchange vessels. So there are different techniques, but really the key is just keeping any free water away from the mixing portion. So, they don't want to separate in the column. It's never going to be a perfect mix. You're always going to have a disparity, likely from bottom to top. Usually the bottom is a little bit cation heavy. The top is usually a little anion heavy. It's not the end of the world if they're within 5–10%. Heck, you can make a mix bed of 80% anion and 20% cation. Might be a little wonky, but it'll still make mixed bed quality water. Conversely, you can have a really cation heavy mixed bed, and then it'll still make mixed bed quality water. Where it really rears its ugly head is capacity. But if you follow good mixing techniques and keeping that free water away from the mixer, it's above the resin bed, you can really keep it together quite well. And when you go to transfer it, you'll get a pretty consistent mix in every single one of the tanks you load. And then speaking of loading, again, loading, same thing. Dry loading is always the best because there's no water. If you have no water involved, there's nothing to worry about, right? There's no separation. But again, wet loading is more than adequate. Wet loading is the preferred method because it's faster. The biggest thing we need to do is make sure we get the water out of the tank. I don't care if you're loading a jumbo. I don't care if you're loading 8/18s, the little guys, or just the typical 2–3 cubic foot vessels. Main thing to do is to make sure the water's getting out of the tank as you're loading the resin into it. Because again, these resins want to separate. They're designed to. So the only thing that's going to get them to separate is if they have room with water to want to come apart. So either you maybe hook up a vacuum on the suction, or so if you think of a typical 1447, you have your inlet, your outlet, your fill port. Well, that outlet has that riser tube to the bottom. If you were to hook up some sort of vacuum to that and suck the water out as it's coming in from the fill port to load it up, well, every bead of resin that gets in there really won't have a chance to separate because there's just no water present. So that's loading. So I'm running out of time. Storing resin. The biggest thing I want to highlight here is carbon dioxide intrusion. CO2, just like in the water, that can occupy exchange capacity on the resin, it can also come from the air. There's roughly 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the air itself. If you leave a anion resin exposed to the atmosphere, that CO2 is going to slowly dissolve into the resin or slowly exchange onto the resin, for lack of a better term. And you can lose 1% of your resin in 24 hours. And when I say that, I'm talking about you leave it open, like you leave a drum open in the back of the shop. Well, that top 1 inch in a day is going to be gone. It's going to be completely exhausted. So you want to keep your resin stored, ideally wet, underwater and sealed in either a drum or your tank. Now it's easier said than done. A lot of times you're preparing them to be sent out into the field. It's okay if you put the water out of the tank, just make sure they're sealed up, make sure they're closed, make sure as much air as possible doesn't get in there, because you don't want to see the CO2 destroy the resin. And if you are managing components versus mixes at the end, ideally, obviously you want to mix them immediately, but if you guys have smelled the anion resin, it smells like dead fish. Keep that sucker closed up underwater as much as possible to minimize as much odor as possible getting into the air, because those amines are pretty offensive. They're not dangerous or anything. They're just offensive itself. Kind of already covered this, and getting to the troubleshooting, I'm not going to go crazy into this, but assuming everything went well with your regeneration, and you're having trouble in the field, the question is your equipment a problem? Is there a distributor broken in the tank? Is how they're monitoring or hooking things up broken? Do you have a leaky valve? How many times have we seen that? Like, oh, the tank lasted 3 days. It usually lasts a month. Well, the city water valve, the tap water valve was open to the RO storage tank, etc. Things like that. Did the operator plug the tanks, hook up the tanks backwards, etc. Things like that. So was it an equipment issue? Was it human error? Next item is water chemistry. That's probably by far the most that we see. Is something changed? The RO is not working as efficiently as once before. Municipal supplies change sources all the time. Especially in different times of the year when the water demands change. Did they go to a well source versus the reservoir from the surface source? Well, those TDSs can be very different, etc. The media itself, is there right amount of resin in the tank? Did we lose resin? Again, back to regeneration. The condition of the resin, is it oxidized? Is it getting fouled? Is it just old? Resin floats can get old just like anything else. If you're not adding resin and taking resin out on a consistent basis, that resin's just going to degrade. So if you're in a situation where you're not introducing new resin to your float, you can see the resin age take its toll on your service exchange. Housekeeping. At the end of the day, just keep everything stored properly. Keep your floors clean, because resin on the floor can, like little ball bearings, if you ever slipped on them. Keeping your floats separate if you can, I think helps make your consistent results in the field based on your expectations for your customer. And then take your time. The regeneration process is the key to your product. So if something is amiss or something is off, it's going to keep showing its ugly head down the road for you. So paying attention to those details, I think, is very important. All right, that's that. All right, an hour and
All right,
3 minutes,
Bill.
Dave. Sorry, I was trying to get it under an hour.
No, that's okay. You did great. I'm sure everybody appreciates it. It looks like most people are hanging in there. So before we move on to the Q&A, and we do have some questions queued up, and Caitlin's going to take them through there. I know one of the questions on the Q&A is part 1 available to view? From Eric Smith. Yes, it is. I'm putting in the URL right into your question there, Eric. And those of you who are interested, feel free to go into the answered questions, find that exchange between Eric and I, click the link, and you'll see the webinar from part 1. Also, you can ask your rep or send an email to us at webinars@resintech.com. We're happy to respond. If you scan this QR code, you can give us your feedback while you're thinking about it right now. We'd appreciate it. And we'll move on to the Q&A. I'll turn it over to Caitlin to ask the questions, and hopefully you guys will hang in there and listen to Bill's responses.
All right, question 1. So from earlier in the webinar, when you were showing the curves of the sodium and calcium efficiencies, we got a question. I thought that calcium was more readily removed than sodium because of selectivity, so I don't normally remove hardness prior to DI. Is that not correct?
Repeat the second part, Caitlin.
So due to selectivity, Eric thought that calcium is more readily removed than sodium in the
During
regeneration.
service? or during regeneration.
during regeneration?
No, it's the
Yeah,
opposite. So
it's the
sodium is
opposite.
actually really easy to get off, relatively easy to get off during regeneration. The problem is if you leave too much behind, it's the first thing that leaks off on the subsequent service run. Conversely, hardness doesn't really leak off DI resin. It's more or less a, it'll hang on there. You're not really going to see a hardness leakage during service, but it is a little bit tougher to get off the resin. But if you're using a brine kill during separation in your plant, you're taking a lot of this hardness away. Now, not all the time. Again, it depends on how much brine, the concentration, and how much you're really throwing at it. But if you're putting it more in the sodium form, you can get higher regeneration levels than one
Okay.
that's left in the calcium form. And this is kind of counterintuitive to me. I think maybe that's where he's coming from too, is, I was always taught, and I'm sure you were too, Caitlin, that selectivity reversal, really the divalent versus monovalent is a lot more efficient, right? And we see that here when we talk about sulfate on the anion side, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't I wish Peter was listening or in to ask that, but I don't really understand why it's counterintuitive when it comes to calcium, because you would think that selectivity reversal would be better, but it isn't. It's just calcium's harder to get off than sodium is.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll ask
And
Peter.
I've had that question a lot too, where people are like, hey, should I soften before my DI bed? And from a resin capacity in that moment in time service perspective, there's no difference. The resin is exchanging ions, right? It's taking out equivalents of whether it's sodium, calcium, magnesium, or whatever else cationic that might be in the water. But when it comes to regen, that's where it can be an advantage if you wanted it to be. If you're not using brine to separate, if you are taking out the hardness before your DI beds, well, guess what? Your resins in the sodium form, you'll get more efficient regeneration in theory, right? But if you're using brine to separate your mixed bed, you're converting a lot of this calcium form over to the sodium form. Okay, so you kind of do yourself a favor when you do that, but that's kind of minutia stuff. If we take a step back in terms of mixed bed capacity, and we talk about what the limiting factors are for these kind of numbers down here, it's always the anion resin. When we talk about the mix of a cation, typical mixed bed is 40% cation, 60% anion by volume. The idea is you're going to have 1-to-1 sites. For every one cation site, there's an anion. Well, if we're in the scenario where you have, an RO feed, and you only got 1 ppm of TDS, which is really the cations and the anions, and now we're tossing in 5-10 ppm of CO2. Well, those are all going to occupy anion sites. Well, there's no cation to balance that. So in the end, all these mixed beds are heavily cation, really cation heavy. And you always have excess cation. If you ever really watch a typical mixed bed exhaust, what's the pH coming out of it in the end? Or, what do we normally see? Well, it's usually a really low pH. And that's because the anion is completely exhausted and there's plenty of cation capacity left over spitting out hydrogen. So that's the case no matter whether the resin was in the calcium or the sodium form to begin with when you regenerated it. You're always going to have this excess left over. So we're kind of splitting hairs a little bit there too. Like, I don't want to see everybody run out like, oh, I got to put a water softener in front of my DI beds. My answer is going to be don't, because your anion capacity is your limiting factor. It's not your cation. So whether you got a less efficient regen on the cation side due to calcium form versus sodium form, it's really not going to be the end of the world.
Bill, can I just chime in for just 1 second here?
Yeah.
And not just to go back, not on the topic, but on webinars in general. I wanted to let the people who are participating know that we've arranged with the WQA so they can get continuing education credits for these webinars as well. So if you've attended this one or any of the other webinars, we're sending your name to WQA and they'll add that to your account, just as an FYI. So that's more incentive for people to join these webinars going forward. Go ahead, Caitlin, next question.
Okay, so for domestic applications, in which stage should we implement a mixed bed cartridge, before or after carbon cartridge?
Domestic as in potable?
I think they mean like filters because they're talking about the cartridges.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. So, and we'll put this in two contexts because domestic is, to me means a couple different things. So if you're talking about like a small scale system, right? So let's say you wanted to make DI quality water for whatever application, and you're going to use one of those nice little tight little RO systems. I know Aries makes them or sells them, and I know they're all over the place. You can buy them online for that matter. So to really get the benefit of what the mixed bed can do for you is you put it in the last stage. So it'd be after RO membrane, and the last stage be the last thing the water sees, because that's where it'll polish up whatever comes through the RO membrane. And that's really where you'll make the most, or the highest level of quality of water for the longest period of time, because the RO is doing most of the work, taking out the TDS and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even with the CO2, it's better off removing CO2 with a couple ppm of TDS versus 150 TDS, right? So, but on a domestic perspective, when we put it in that context of potable water, we don't see a lot of mixed bed in potable water. And it's not that you can't, but these resins aren't really ANSI NSF 61. So you kind of lose that pedigree going into a drinking water situation. Also, I just think the water tastes terrible. It doesn't taste great. RO is much better than mixed bed quality water. And a lot of times, don't forget, these resins, these anion resins smell like that fish. Well, they leach into the water, and they can. And you may not smell it immediately, but if they were to heat that water up or whatever they might be using, you do run a risk of introducing smell. So mixed bed polishing in a drinking water application, you might be creating some other problems that the customer doesn't like. But again, you can certainly use it. That's your decision. You're not violating any laws or anything, but it doesn't carry a pedigree. And if they like the taste of it, then it is. I mean, I know there's one company that sells it's that zero water pitcher filter. Like, that's kind of their thing, is mixed bed resin. It's no different than the mixed beds we're talking about here. And that's what they do, but that's their product. That's what they sell. So I guess we could all do it if we wanted to, but I personally am just not a fan of it. So.
All right. Next question.
Yep.
So for during the anion regeneration, targeting 105 degrees Fahrenheit, is there a better temperature over like other temperatures for that heated?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to what's the max you can really throw it at, cation resin, you could throw boiling water at it, not going to hurt it, and tongue in cheek, I say that. I mean, it's got a limit of, I think, about 230. But, we're not really worried about anion or cation resin when it comes to temperature. Anion resin has an upper temperature limit of 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So really think anything less than 140 is ideal. In terms of what's the minimum, I think that 110 to 120 is kind of your goal, because you're kind of getting the most benefit. Plus, when you think about the heat, our skin tends to scald and burn at 125. So I think it's good to stay under that just from a safety perspective. But anywhere 110, 120 is more than adequate. If you get the water too hot, once you start getting 140 degrees and above, what actually happens is that the anion functional groups literally come off the resin. The technical term is called cleaving. What ends up happening is it just pops right off the backbone. It's gone forever. So we get that question a lot as well with hot water, like, hey, I need a hot water mixed bed. What do you got? I'm like, no, this is it. I mean, this is the anion resin in the world. But I need to apply it at 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. Well, you can apply it at 160 degrees Fahrenheit. It'll still make DI quality water for a period of time. But what ends up happening is that the mixed bed you go to subsequent regen, all of a sudden this lost 40, 50% capacity, because the functional groups just aren't there, because they cleaved off. But when they cleave off, they're just basically organic amines. They are cationic in water. So the cation exchange resin actually removes them. So that's how you can still make high quality water in a high temperature environment, because anything that pops off the anion goes onto the cation and it still makes the quality. But now the mixed bed is pretty much cooked. So it's you're not going to be able to really recover it and reuse it at the same level. I certainly wouldn't want to see anybody mixing that back into their float. You really would want to set it aside, or for me, I just make them pay for it. Okay, I'll give you a mixed bed, $200 a cubic foot, knock yourself out, but, be mindful of temperature, keep it below 140, that 110 to 120 is ideal, I think.
Right. Okay. So next question.
Yep.
Do you know of anyone who stores their anion resin with noble gases like arsenic? I mean, argon, sorry.
No, but you could. I don't see why you couldn't. It's really expensive, you know. You could use nitrogen. You could use any inert gas, really. But you could also just, button up your tank and don't let the air in. Even if a little bit's trapped in there, eventually it'll get sucked up. Really the issue with air intrusion with anion or mixed bed is in the hydroxide form is just that constant availability of CO2 to be absorbed from the air. So you could certainly use a noble gas if you wanted to, but I think you can also solve the same problem, but just sealing it up, sealing up that tank, with, instead of just screwing on a fitting, tape it up or, I don't know. I'm not that averse, educated on, but I'm sure there's gas impermeable tape out there, right? Some of our higher end mixed beds, like we get in our ultra and our nano grade, we do, standard packaging for that is a gas impermeable liner inside of the drum for this purpose, to prevent as much CO2 intrusion as possible. In fact, we did something really cool. We had a customer that wanted the resin in a super sack. This is high-end mixed bed and super sacks, which is typically we're like, no, don't do it because of the CO2. We actually found our ops manager, who's a genius, found a company that can make like this big bag the size of a super sack. So they literally lowered the super sack into the gas impermeable bag and sealed it up and then shrunk wrap it. So it was basically a Mylar gas impermeable super sack for long-term storage. I have pictures of it somewhere. It's pretty cool. But minimizing air intrusion will, do the same thing as storing it under a noble gas. So you can do it, but there's other ways to do it too that will prevent it.
And then the next one is, can you explain freeboarding in a little more detail from Jen Criswell?
Yeah, sure. So freeboard, what is freeboard? When we talk about it in a classic sense, like in a water softener or a carbon filter that you backwash, it's the amount of space that the resin will expand, right? So a lot of times, I'm going to talk about it in the context of a water softener, and then I'll bring it in on the mixed bed DI side. Typical water softener design, you're going to design it for 50% freeboard, meaning when you go to backwash and the flow rate you're going to use to lift the resin to clean it, we're going to expand the resin 50%. So we're going to take a cubic foot, we're going to expand it another 50% to basically occupy 1.5 cubic feet, right? So that's 50%. So we're going to have this space in a tank. So you got a tank that holds, let's say your unit's 5 cubic feet, and we want to make sure we expand 50%. Well, we need to have 7.5 cubic feet of space inside so that when we lift the resin, it expands, right? When we talk about it in the context of a separator, you're really expanding it high. Like you really want to get those resins very well expanded from each other. So we're talking about 100% expansion or 100% freeboard, really. You need the freeboard for 100% expansion. So if I were to regenerate 1 cubic foot of mixed bed, I need room for 2, right? Because I want to double the volume of the resin because I'm backwashing and lifting it up and lifting it up. So any freeboard above that tank, any open space in the tank, that's what we call freeboard. So in the context of a separator, the freeboard is there for expansion, so we get the proper separation of the mixed bed. When we talk about what goes into an exchange tank, a lot of times these field vessels, either the little tanks like the little 818s, most common sizes are like the 9, 12, 14, 47s, kind of the 1, 2, 3 cubic foot sizes. We want to pack that resin full in that tank just to get as much resin in there as possible. If we leave too much freeboard and they go to fill it up and maybe the tanks get moved around and sloshed, you've given space with free water and allowing the resin to move. And as we talked about, at least I tried to talk about quite a bit, was if you have mixed bed ability to spread out, right? It wants to separate. So if we leave too much freeboard in the tank, or basically too much volume of water with nothing occupying it, such as resin, and the resin hits it or is allowed to move around in it, you cause separation. And that can happen in a service vessel. That can happen during resin transfers when you're loading the tanks. We want to keep as much free water, free space, free board out of that tank as possible, so we don't have this happen. Because it's happened. You know, something happened during transfer. We had too much water. You know, all it takes is a little bit of cation resin to get to the bottom of that exchange vessel for the field to shoot the works up. You know, you'll never rinse up the quality. It'll still deionize and make deionized water, but it may not make the quality that you're looking for. And sometimes you can track it back to, well, when I loaded the tank, I didn't really get the water out of it. That resin just hit the free water and started separating right then and there. So freeboard has multiple contexts, but in the case of loading a tank and sending it in the field, we want to avoid any free space that would allow the resin to separate.
Okay, Eric Smith, you had a question you wanted to ask directly?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Bill, great presentation, by the way.
Thanks, buddy. Good. Glad you're here.
I have been doing this a long time, and I've learned a lot in just a short period. So,
Okay.
but on the questions I had, I want to add a little context. On the first one, I've always thought about following the theory of selectivity on the calcium versus sodium.
Yep.
That is more on the service side of it. So when I go install a DI, I normally would not install a water softener prior to a DI set, because the ease of regeneration of removing the hardness versus the sodium. Is that accurate?
No, it doesn't matter on the service side. The resin's going to remove the ions equally, whether it's a sodium, a calcium, or magnesium. That doesn't matter. What matters is on the regen side, right? So, you know, if sodium's easier to regen off, it would behoove you to say, oh yeah, I'm going to make sure my resin's in as much sodium form as possible. But it's not practical, because there's so much excess cation capacity in a mix bed at any given, I don't care what the application is. It's always excess.
Okay.
You know, you don't really need to gain that extra. In the end, it's maybe 10%. It's not enough to say, okay, I need to go out and put water softeners in front of all my DI installs. No, that's what I was trying to get the point across, is don't do that. It's not worth it.
Agreed. The other one on the temp. Right now, we target 105.
Yep.
But now by listening to you, you're really saying 110 to 120.
You can push it. Yeah, absolutely. You know, you're not going to harm the resin. You're not going to harm the process.
Okay.
And I'm assuming you're not going to harm the equipment.
Sure.
As long as you keep, from a resin chemistry perspective, just keep it under 140. From a personnel safety equipment perspective, that's probably going to be your limiting factor most of the time. You know, can your tank handle 120?
Sure.
Can your pipe, you know, all that stuff, right?
Sure.
So, you know, but the resin itself can take up to 140 without much issue.
Okay. So, but in your mind, 110 to 120.
Yeah, that's usually where I see it, and it's the most effective.
Okay. That was the main question. And again, I appreciate you let me add a little context to these questions.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if you saw my joke.
No, I have been reading chat. I've been laser focused on my slides and not picking my nose as I'm talking to you people.
we bought a DI company once, and the plant guy used to use a cement mixer.
Yeah, right. I love that.
And we made fun of that dude for, I can't tell you how, we would still make fun of him today if we had a discussion about it.
Makes a heck of a mix bed, man. It's
we
perfect every single time. There's no variability. The only issue is the air intrusion, and then the stench of the anion resin.
Sure, and now that you say it that way, it kind of makes sense. We thought it was just kind of goofy to do that, but
yeah. Well, we actually, I mean, back, you know, I've been resin tech, you know, a long time, and I remember the original plant that I saw. You know, they did wet mixing, but they did a lot of resin in a cement mixer, you know, when we were making the virgin product. And today we have this, and we still do some, but they have this really thing called a V blender, where they can put like 90 or 100 cubic feet in this thing. And it's just basically it's like literally shaped like a V, and it just rotates at a really weird rate. And really, you know, some engineer came up with an oscillation you know, I don't know, Caitlin probably can explain it better than I can, but
Like,
just in an odd shape, but it basically does the same thing. It just intimately dry mixes solids like a resin.
right.
And but you could test a sample at any point in time in the mix, and it's exactly the same over and over again. Versus a wet mix, what I see a lot of, you're shooting for 60-40, right? 60
Sure.
anion, 40 cat. What I see a lot of the bottoms are, you're actually getting, 45% of cation at the bottom, and then there's only like 35% towards the top. And that's not uncommon to see that kind of variability in mix in a wet mixing scenario.
Sure, but you're right. Dry mixing would.
Yeah, you nail it every single time. It's just so labor intensive and a pain in the butt, right? It's who wants to do it? I mean, if you got a plant that's cranking, the last, you're trying to do a batch a day, out of tank, in tank,
Yeah, no,
it's a lot of time, right?
I agree.
Okay.
Blower versus air compressor.
That was the last one.
We always use a blower.
Yeah, blower's good. I mean, I think you can use either or. You don't really need a ton of air flow or pressure. I mean, I guess that needs context to the size of the mixer vessel, but
You don't need pressure, but you need volume. You need
yeah.
volume, not air pressure.
I don't think you need a ton. So I think it all comes down to the size of your plant,
Okay.
and how much air you really need. What equipment do you want to manage? Air compressors work. I mean, they both have their bugaboos in terms of, what can go wrong and break. You certainly don't want oils and
That's
getting stuff into the line. So it's where a blower makes a little bit more sense, right?
That's always been our concern is we have seen oil fouling.
Yep.
From some cheaper compressors that we've used, but
Yep,
the rings aren't quite so tight. You're going to get oil on, and I've actually ruined a batch or two whenever.
Oh, sure.
Steel has
Yeah,
lead.
I think that's a big thing when it comes to compressors. You got to stay on top of that. I mean, they make those separators and filters for the lines, like use them,
Right.
Because people don't. They just ignore them, and then something goes wrong, and you open up that thing, and you're like, oh boy, you can feel it in the line, right?
Yeah,
So,
and I never trusted filters. To me, a blower is a lot more expensive up front on the
yeah, but
capital
it's
side.
and I think they're more reliable long term, personally. But
I
I haven't owned a plant, so you know way better than I do, right?
Well, they're expensive, so I believe that's all my questions, sir. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
and
thanks, Eric.
very good
Appreciate your time,
presentation.
man.
Good
Yep.
deal. Thanks, Eric. Okay. Any other questions for Bill, Caitlin, or are we through our queue?
Yeah, we're through the queue. I've got a couple. I've got just one or two more.
Go ahead.
So okay. How would I minimize TOC throw from a regenerated mix bed?
That's a very good question. Minimizing throw. Well, two ways we can think about this one. One, resin's in a constant state of degradation. Like it is. That's where the TOC comes from, especially as the resin ages, right? When the resin's new, it's a little bit different of an animal. You've got not only the degradation portion, but just kind of what I call the leftovers from production itself. And if you're buying a resin from us that kind of already has a pedigree, we've kind of taken care of most of that for you already. So most of the time in a regen scenario, you're just kind of dealing with degradation over time. I don't really think you can manage that per se, because it just is what it is. Where you really have to manage TOC throw off a resin is how you treat it on the back end, right? So it's actually weird. Newer resins will throw more TOC at the beginning because of the leftovers. But after maybe half a dozen regens, I don't know, pick a number, all that kind of is out of the way by then. It really comes back to just what the resin's aging at the time. And really to get the TOC down post regeneration is just basically to recirculate it with the UV, rinse it with a low TOC water, maybe recirculate it with the UV. I think that's the most practical thing you can do in the field to maintain a TOC spec for your client. I don't think you can get consistently out of your regeneration process a low TOC product. I think you have to recirculate with the UV. Because what the UV does is it breaks down those TOC chemistries, makes them ionic, and then the mix bed picks them up. So whether it's the mixed bed you just made, picking it up, or you have another tank of mixed bed there to pick it up, I think that's really the only way you can get a consistent low TOC product, which is post-treating with the UV. If you want to monitor that, having a TOC monitor, which everybody here knows those things aren't cheap. You can trust your process if you want to try that. I think there's risk involved there, but if you recirculate it for an hour, is that going to be enough to achieve a spec? Maybe, but I think that'll come with some trial and error of understanding the age of the resin, the regeneration process you performed, and are you getting the same results over and over again? And I think that becomes your process if you want to try to avoid measuring the TOC itself. But you want 100% ironclad TOC results, TOC monitor, recirculation, UV. It's the only real way you're going to get there.
All right.
Anything else, Caitlin?
Mm-mm.
Okay, Bill, just go to that last slide with the future webinars, if you don't mind. Just to remind the people that are left on the call, for our next webinar, it's probably going to be on PFAS. If not, it'll be Deionization Part III.
Yeah, I'm taking a break, people. July.
Bill needs
Vacation
to,
month.
these are so popular, Bill needs to build a whole new presentation.
Yeah,
So, and that'll probably be a deep dive on some high purity applications, right, Bill?
Yeah, it'll be fun. Yeah, I think we'll get away from the process side of making it to how we're applying it in the field a little bit and try to pick a few.
Okay. And in the meantime, we'll probably take a look at PFAS. We'll talk about identifying the various PFAS contaminants and potential solutions for remediation. So be sure to join us for that. If you've attended any of our webinars, you'll be sure to get an invitation for that one, and we encourage you to register in advance. And as far as this one goes, we'll be sending out the links. I think the same link that you click to get on here, you can use to view a recording of this presentation starting tomorrow. But if not, feel free to email us at webinars@resintech.com, and we'll probably be sending out a link and a PDF anyway. Thanks to all of you who joined us today and in all of our prior webinars. And thank you, Bill, for working so hard to put this together for all of us, and
Sure.
Caitlin and everybody else who participated. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Very good, Bill. Bye.
Thanks, buddy.